Chapter 4. Location: Southern Utah. Date: June 14th. Jarren, Calavan. "You've been out in the heat too long." The woman stared down at him, her skin glistening with a sheen of sweat that looked as natural as the earth around her. Her thick hair surrounded her head like a halo of curls, blocking out the sun. "I am not your mother." Jarren swallowed the dryness in his throat. The water had given him energy, but he still felt dizzy. The picture of his mother in the only salvageable file on his dad's laptop was from 20 years ago. She had changed, but she hadn't aged. The easy smile in the picture was gone, replaced by sharp eyebrows drawn down in mistrust. "I'm looking for Selena." "Are you a descendant of angels?" Jarren asked, widening his stance so his body wouldn't betray his queasiness. That wasn't the introduction he had imagined. He hadn't meant to sound like a little boy who had been lost in the grocery store. All he wanted was to stand like a man and face his mother like he had never cared that she'd left. The tip of a sharpened stick pressed against his Adam's apple before he realized she was moving. She held the weapon against his throat. "How do you know to ask that question? If you are a hunter from the Triune, they were foolish to send only one." The tip of a sharpened stick pressed against his Adam's apple before he realized she was moving. She held the weapon against his throat. "How do you know to ask that question? If you are a hunter from the Triune, they were foolish to send only one." She pressed harder, and the tip cut into his skin. He leaned away, but the stone beneath him shifted, growing up around his ankles and holding his feet in place. If he leaned back any more, he'd fall and be on the ground again. Instead of leaning back, he pressed his shoulders forward, leaning his head towards Selena. The point of the spear caught on his throat. He flinched from the pain as the tip broke skin, clenching his teeth against the fear that pulsed from his belly. Selena's eyes widened for a second, then narrowed. She didn't pull the stick back, but she lessened the pressure so that he could stand straight. A trickle of blood from the wound dripped down his neck and soaked into the collar of his shirt. "What do you know about Descendants?" Selena asked again. "What do you want from me?" He pushed down the fear, reminding himself that he was different since Ellie had healed him. Instead of answering, he tilted his chin and focused on the wound in his neck. Selena's spear shifted lower toward his collarbone. A cool sensation pulsed out from his core as his body pulled energy from the ground to heal the wound. He hadn't been able to heal himself before Ellie had changed him. He'd been normal. Not exactly normal, but not that different from everyone else. Now he didn't know what he was, or why he hadn't been able to do these things before. The wound closed. His skin stitched itself together, and the trickle of blood stopped. He focused on the stone around his ankles. He could sense the rocks, the cracks and weaknesses in its structure. He pushed, and the stone cracked and shattered away from his ankles, releasing his feet. He stepped towards Selena, and she stumbled back. "Who are you?" Selena asked. "Have you come from the Vale?" There was a note of desperate hope. "Have you come to invite us back?" Jarren sensed movement around him, the stone in the walls of the canyon shifting as she prepared a defense that was far beyond his capability to stop. Her eyes shone with a fiery hatred that made him believe she would bring the cliffs down on top of him if he said the wrong thing. "I'm not from the Vale, and the Triune didn't send me to hunt you down." He raised his hands in surrender, lowering his shoulders and ducking his head. He wasn't used to turning off the aggressive side of his mind. It was all he'd been taught. Be the bigger man, be the powerhouse in the room. He knew these lessons wouldn't serve him now. "I came on my own. I have some questions and I need your help." Selena made a small wave with her fingers, like someone breaking the strings of a spider web. The canyon walls returned to their natural state. "What is your name?" She pulled the spear to her side, less threatening, but ready for use. He wiped at his neck. A small smear of blood came off on his fingertips. "Jarren Calavan." Selena leaned against the spear for support. Her hand flew to her throat and her chest heaved as she gasped for air. She looked at him and then away, shaking her head. "No, it can't be. I need you to help me understand what I am, and why I'm different." He wanted to reach out to her and take her hand, to fall on his knees and beg her to stay with him always, pull her into a hug and cry tears he had never shed into her shoulder. He hated himself for it. He folded his arms and puffed up his chest into a power pose. Now that she was off balance, he would show his strength, even if he was faking it. "He told me I could find you here," Jarren said. "Impossible." The words came out like a hiss from a released pressure valve. "He didn't know where to find me. No one did." "Right." Jarren nodded in agreement. "He told me how to find you. He gave me your scent. I've been searching for months." Selena's eyes combed the edges of the canyon above them, scanned the banks of the small pond. She searched the area without turning her back or taking her attention off of him. "Xander Calavan is your father?" She wasn't about to let assumption make a fool of either of them. "Yes." Her eyes went wide and glassy as tears formed. "You're my son? My baby I used to hold in my arms." She made the universal motion of rocking a baby. Jarren felt a sting. He wouldn't fit in those arms now. "And you've come back. Just like she said. That means he's here, finally. You brought him with you, right? Where is he?" Jarren had to blink hard against the sweat that dripped into his eyes. The sun beat down on them despite the early morning hour. Selena showed no signs of discomfort from the heat, but the hope in her eyes left him as uncomfortable on the inside as he was on the outside. He swallowed, his throat sticky from thirst, and a lump stuck somewhere between his tongue and his heart. He kept his face neutral, no emotion. A true businessman, like his dad. "Xander is dead," Jarren said. Selena's arms dropped. Jarren could almost see the baby memory of himself disappearing with Selena's disappointment. "Dead? But I left you with him." She reached out and touched both sides of his face, as if searching for the baby he'd been, the child she'd never touched like that. "You were supposed to save him." Bile rose in his throat at her expectation of him. He turned away and knelt next to the pond, pulling water to his mouth with his cupped palm, careful to drink more slowly. The water was cool and refreshing, but he had to fight to swallow both the water and the lump in his throat. "I tried." Jarren blinked hard, but his vision still blurred. "He sold his soul to the Triune and tried to recover the twin daggers. He was stabbed with the white dagger. The demon essence was scattered, but the damage to his body was too much. He told me to find you." It was the last thing he said. He repeated the explanation like a memorized report. He tried not to let pictures of that night seep into his mind. He didn't mention the part about Xander shoving the knife further into his own chest, the apology, or the look of pride in his dad's eyes as the light went out. "He sold his soul?" Selena stood as still as the rocks around them. "When?" Jarren splashed the water over his face before he stood up. He could face this woman. She'd left them. She'd left him. As much as Xander Calavan had ignored him as a child, at least he had been there. "He signed the contract before I was born." Jarren didn't know how to ask the question he'd carried in his mind, like an overburdened backpack. Why wasn't she there? What had happened? Did she know he'd sold his soul? Had she left him with a man who was owned by the Triune? Emotions played out on Selena's face, like an orchestra warming up for a performance. Small twitches that moved the muscles beneath her skin with the same force as a continental shift. He thought he saw his own sorrow reflected in her eyes, but then her eyebrows came down, her jaw tightened, and her lips pressed together. She knew. The words were forced through her lips. "I missed every second of your childhood because of her, and she knew before she told me. She betrayed me." The bitterness in her voice was sharp and sour, like the first taste of a lemon. Jarren glanced around, worried that Selena's time isolated in this heat had done something to her mind. "Who are you talking about? Who betrayed you?" Selena lifted her stick like a weapon again, holding the length of it in both hands, in a battle stance. He reached for the dirt and rocks at his feet, preparing to defend himself. If she could use the ground as a weapon, he could too. Adura. The name was familiar, but Jarren couldn't place it. He shook his head to show her he didn't understand. She clenched her jaw and seemed to have to mentally pry it open to get the words out. The visionary. The descendant of angels who could bend light around time. She said she saw you. She said that if I left you, if I left my baby boy, you would save him. You would be the key to Xander Calavan's salvation, not his death. She knew the whole time that he'd already signed the contract for his soul. Because of her, I left you for nothing. There was too much to take in, but his mind clung to one thought, one possibility. "You didn't want to leave me?" Selena flipped the spear around and jammed the sharp end into the red dirt at their feet. The earth rumbled, the walls of the canyon shook, and the surface of the water rippled. The spear changed, branches growing from the sides, small buds sprouting. What was once a spear became a small tree. "I've mourned my decision for 18 years. You are here as a man when I loved you as a baby. All those years lost, and now I can see it has all been for nothing. Xander is dead, and Adura is a liar." Jarren stood facing her, wanting to put her hands on his face again. Feel like the child who wanted his mother, but she only studied his face for a moment longer, as if seeking the child she'd lost. Her face crumpled in pain, and she turned and walked away. He felt off balance, and it wasn't just from the earthquake Selena had caused. She hadn't been clear about what part of her decision she'd mourned. The fact that she'd left a baby on his father's doorstep, or the fact that she'd left Xander Calavan. She certainly wasn't acting like she wanted anything to do with him now. It wasn't a new feeling, but he'd come here for more than answers. He needed to know what he could do. "You don't have to be happy that I'm here," Jarren said, running after her, "but I want to understand what happened to me. I want to know what I can do." Selena stopped. She pulled her shoulders back, her posture as straight as a steel beam. "You have never trained? I didn't know what I was until a few months ago. How is that possible?" He clenched his fists, fighting the frustration that rose in him. "I don't know. I think something happened to me that blocked my abilities. And someone fixed it, but not all the way. Something is wrong with me, and I need your help to understand." Selena wiped at her forehead, her fingers curling like she wished she had the spear back in her hand. "I will train you for 3 days, but then I am leaving. Someone needs to answer for their lies."